Hello folk, how you doing? Scotty. So I've touched upon before on the Great Depression, briefly pointed out statistics before, even from this particular book, How Capitalism Saved America, End the Fed by Ron Paul. He has also mentioned about the Great Depression, of course. You know, I was looking for material, I was looking to learn about the Great Depression and stuff like that, and of course he mentioned about the Federal Reserve and its role with the open market operations. As well, of course, Tom Woods mentions even in The Real Descent. This particular boy that I've been asked to respond on, I don't even directly debate with these type of people because it's like Vosh, right? All they do is fling abuse, use baseless claims, and they pretend that that's an argument, right? It's a bit like a socialist that comes across to you and says, oh well, you read books, how's that an argument? You know what I mean? It doesn't even provide any sort of argument. Have a listen to this argument.
Did President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal economic policies pull the country out of the Great Depression?
It has, and we have decades of proof showing that. So before I get more into the video, I wanted to debunk this retard. This Professor Lee Ohanian, or whatever the fuck his last name is a proven fraud. His bullshit stats on how the Great Depression, New Deal policies didn't work have been proven incorrect by numerous economics and historians that actually know what the fuck they're talking about. And he works with the Hoover Institute, which is a right-wing think tank that's been proven debunked, just like the American Enterprise Institute, which I destroyed in my other PragerU video.
Now you can obviously hear from his argument, you know, it's the usual abuse and stuff like that and the baseless claims, so I'm just going to cut straight to the argument here. Relative to the statistics that I've pointed out before, of course there's even a particular video that Tom Woods, an excellent video by the way, the unemployment statistics I touched upon before, so let's look at that. In 1929 folk, the unemployment sat at the lowest point in 3.2%. You've got to remember this was the height of the Great Depression. In 1930, it was 8.7%. Then 1931 drove up to 15.9%. 1932, 23.6%. And eventually in 1933 it would sit at 24.9%. Now it's important to note that these socialists love to have you believe that Herbert Hoover was a man who was somehow laissez-faire. He wasn't laissez-faire until after he had learned his lesson of the destruction that he had actually caused. He was economically incompetent. To quote what Tom DiLorenzo says, Hoover may have been a world-class mining engineer, but he had a dangerously poor grasp of economics, which fed his desire to remake American society. John Hoff Wilson describes Hoover's basic economic beliefs as follows, unquote, there was too much lawlessness, destructive competition and economic waste, too much unemployment and repetitiveness in factory work. The 12-hour day was too long, labour lacked the guarantee of collective bargaining, child labour still existed despite pre-war progressive legislation, education was inadequate in most states, some people were making too much money far beyond the needs of stimulation to initiative. This was a man who believed at the time in economic central planning to such a varying extent. He exacerbated the problem of the Great Depression of 1929 through all the printing, borrowing and spending, as Keynesians would call it, apparently stimulating the economy, and I've already mentioned before about their so-called pump priming. Now, it was about 1933 FDR as President of the United States. Although he managed to reduce the unemployment from 1934 21.7%, 1935 20.1%, 1936 16.9%, and then eventually 1937 14.3%. The point being is that in 1937 the unemployment at 14.3% was much higher than it ever was at the height of the Great Depression in 1929 when it had occurred. When you go back in history, just like what Tom DiLorenzo had points out in his book, he mentions about the 1837 Great Depression, or depression as such, and it was over in a very short period of time because of non-interventionist policies. By 1937, sitting at 14.3%. By 1938, what this boy doesn't even bother to mention, the unemployment shot back up at 19.0%. And of course, you would see in 1939, 17.2%, 1940, 14.6%, and the unemployment rates were much lower prior to that period. It's the usual nonsense with socialists, baseless claims, abuse, nothing to actually back up what they've got to say. Just listen to this.
So, this guy is so insane and so radical that he actually attacked Trump for doing some smart economic policies like killing the TPP and doing some tariffs so far in his presidency.
I've touched upon before, folk, the difference between free trade and the protectionist tariffs. Protectionist tariffs is basically imposing a monopoly on trade in the domestic economy and forcing the domestic consumer to spend at the higher cost. And you're basically limiting the consumer's options. So essentially you're reducing the wealth of the consumer and you're harming other countries. And protectionist tariffs were very, very damaging. In fact, it was the protectionist tariffs that resulted in the eventual rise of the American Revolutionary War, as you would see for the likes of the Sugar Act in 1764. I'm sure it was the Townsend Act in 1765. And then you had the Stamp Act that would, closely follow that. And I'm pretty sure that was just a replica of the Stamp Act. And eventually you would see the famous tea tariff in 1733 that would eventually spark the rise of the American Revolutionary War, which, by the way, it was the capitalist merchant class that formed the Boston Tea Party, and of course they would fight for the American Revolutionary War, for the independence of the United States. And then of course you would see the eventual rise of the Morrill Tariff, which in 1860 I'm sure it was, tariff that was nearly 50 odd percent. You could argue it was probably a replica of the one 20 odd years prior to that period, which was the Tariff of Abomination. I think that was something to do with North Carolina. So these tariffs were very problematic. They were not beneficial, maybe to specific special interest groups who would gain a competitive advantage, but of course this boy doesn't provide any argument. He just simply ridicules anybody who disagrees and just passes it off as a good policy, unlike what I've just done here to explain to you.
My research clearly suggests that the answer, contrary to popular belief, is no.
You are factually incorrect, and I will put sources in the description and comments that shows that not only are you wrong, you are a fucking regressive retard like the rest of PragerU.
In fact, the New Deal made matters worse. Let me explain.
By lying and making shit up.
The centerpiece of Roosevelt's New Deal plan to fix the economy was the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, which the president announced with great fanfare in June of 1933. FDR believed that he could use the government to artificially raise both prices and wages. It would work like this. Higher prices would raise profits, that makes business happy, and higher wages would raise income.
It did work, and it worked in other places too that implemented that plan. So, wrong.
So there you have the childish argument, the usual abuse, and of course just spouting baseless claims and what have you, and that's typically just saying, oh well, you're wrong and that's it. Well, how come he's not actually provided an argument for why he's wrong? Now, it's a bit like the previous argument, and it was to do with that of inflation. And the problem with inflation, you did see that with the Great Depression. Of course, they were running the printing press. They had temporarily stripped the gold standard away. They were running the printing press. Inflation was basically soaring, and of course it would send out the wrong signals. When you drive up the prices of everything, you're not just driving up the prices of goods where it's naturally happening, where consumer demand is. You're driving up the price of goods where demand isn't even there. You end up sending out wrong signals where resources end up going to the wrong parts of the market. So this is the problem with the government interventionist policy. It's to do with the malinvestment, and especially an important period like that of a depression. He doesn't understand anything at all to do with the laws of supply and demand.
That makes workers happy. More profits for business mean more money to hire new workers. Higher wages for workers means more money to buy consumer goods.
Yep, exactly. And that's exactly what happens when you implement those policies.
A virtuous cycle is set in motion, and the economy improves rapidly. But here's what FDR missed. Artificially raising wages also raises labor costs.
But the higher wages increases demand, which offsets the labor costs, you fucking moron.
So he makes this baseless claim that demand somehow drives up. He doesn't understand the fact that demand isn't something one-sided. You're raising the price of the employee, which is the price to the employer. When price drives up, demand falls, and when price goes down, demand drives up. And that's how it goes with the laws of supply and demand. That's the behavioural pattern that occurs. An employer is really only going to part with their money if they feel that the value for what they're getting of that employee is going to be greater than the cost of employing them. It's only natural, because you're only going to part with your money if you can justify that. He doesn't understand that with the laws of supply and demand. He thinks it's just a case, it's just as simple as raising their wages artificially and somehow demand is just going to stay the same. It doesn't happen, folk. He'll make it harder for people to enter the workplace. And it is even touched upon by Second Thought of all people. You know, he kept mentioning about that today with the inflation kept wiping it out. And inflation is actually rendering the wages worthless, because you're devaluing the purchasing power of the currency.
And when labor costs go up, business hires fewer workers or no workers at all.
Far-right myth that has been long debunked.
Especially in a difficult economic environment. Meanwhile, artificially raising prices reduces demand for the obvious reason that people buy less of something when its price goes higher.
Wrong again. That is the same bullshit argument that fucking right-wingers and libertarians use to be against the minimum wage, when in reality, when you raise the minimum wage, it increases demand, which allows people to spend more, which allows them to buy more stuff, which then in turn improves the economy so they can get more, so employees can hire more people. This has been proven over and over and over and over again for decades here and in other countries, but these far-right retards refuse to accept it.
You know, the price of something drives up, demand falls. It doesn't go up. Somehow jump off a cliff, you're going to go up the way. It's the same argument here. The demand from the employer, like I touched upon, drives down. And plus the fact in general, when you're speaking about prices of goods and services driving up, because after all, where do you think that's going to come from for the general prices? Well, the inflation. You can see even for the devaluation of the paper currency that for 1913, you can see the devaluation had occurred. So the less value your currency holds, the less that you can buy with it. Now, going back, of course, to the unemployment statistics that further back this, Thomas J. DiLorenzo again goes on to mention more than 10 million Americans were unemployed in 1938 compared with 8 million in 1931, the year before Roosevelt's election. Unemployment levels would come down only after FDR conscripted millions of men and sent them to an overseas war, a fate much worse than the temporary unemployment. Again, he goes on to mention per capita GNP statistics also reveal that in terms of aggregate production, there was no recovery until after World War II ended, and a massive reduction in government expenditures and employment occurred. As seen in table 10.2, per capita gross national product did not recover to its 1929 level until 1940, and even then just barely so. And of course, this is the particular table. You can see in 1929 you would see $857, right up to 1940 it was $916. And as he further states, data on personal consumption expenditures tell the same story. There was no economic recovery. Table 10.3 shows the personal consumption expenditures were approximately 8% lower in 1940 than they were in 1929 at the height of the Great Depression when it had occurred. There was also a massive reduction in private capital investment from 1930 to 1940. Net private investment was minus 3.1 billion as Americans failed to add anything to their capital stock. And of course you can see from this table statistics that there's pretty clear evidence to show it was anything but a recovery for what he's trying to make it to be.
Also, I'll put sources in the description and in the comments that shows that the minimum wage has worked. So you fucking retards that refuse to accept it have no choice but to accept it.
I don't really need to go into the argument with the minimum wage because I've touched upon it numerous times before. You end up seeing the same story o'er and o'er. Have you ever noticed how everywhere socialists touch, it just turns to absolute shit? Just look at Detroit, look what happened to them, and then look at California. It's the exact same story, and see after they've ripped the arse out of an economy like that, they then turn and they start going to places like Arizona and Texas, and they take their ideas with them. It's like a parasitical disease. In fact, it's not even like it just is a parasitical disease. They end up taking their policies with them, and the unemployment drives up because after all you have to require the higher taxes to go with it, and they end up driving business out. I even remember there was an article, a lassie that was working in New York, and she says, oh well, you know, I'm happy I'm now getting paid the $15 minimum wage, but I'm not working enough hours to make up for it. And they think that's just a case of greed. They don't understand the laws of supply and demand, and they don't understand that no all businesses are the same. And then they use the usual irrational argument where they turn around and say to you, well, if businesses can't afford it, they shouldn't be employment, they shouldn't be working in the industry. Well, how's that going to fix an employment issue?
Or hey, you can just continue to throw insults and death threats and rape threats to my mother as much as you want to otherwise.
So why did FDR do this?
Dumbass, we just were in the fucking Great Depression.
Yeah, this is sad, man, right? This boy is just the typical ignoramus that's the subject of your state education system. I've never in my life set foot in the United States of America in my life, folk. Scotland's impact on Canada alone was massive. I've known for a good number of years now, there are so many Americans that don't even haven't even get the slightest clue the massive, enormous impact that Scotland had on their nation. They've not even get the slightest wee bit of understanding. You could practically call their American Revolutionary War a bloody Scottish Revolutionary War, right? They haven't got a clue about their own history, and it's folk like this, even when it comes to, you know, economic history, they haven't even get the slightest clue what they're even going on about in terms of, you know, stuff to do with depressions, etc, etc. See, in 1837, like I pointed out, he mentions how the fact it was over very quickly simply because of a policy of laissez-faire, of stoning off and letting the economy be, because then you've got, of course, resources going to the correct parts of the market where they're more urgently required. Through the freedom of the marketplace, you've got the higher productivity, you've got greater employment opportunity because of the freedom of the market and the lack of government regulation. And of course there is a quote that backs that, unquote. This financial deregulation produced what was arguably the most stable monetary system the United States ever had, off quote. Of course, he wouldn't really understand it and I thought he'd do with that. Of course, that's what happens when you take a non-interventionist approach. Unfortunately, that isn't what happened, especially with the Great Depression, so it's no surprise why there were so many problems.
He had to do the economic plans, which fucking worked.
So one of those particular policies was FDR's Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, you know, drive the price up on the consumer during a depression when they're struggling to spend, and he thinks that that's not going to affect the consumer in any sort of way. And you could argue, well, of course they're making profits and what have you, yeah, for special interest groups and what have you. A protectionist policy, which is basically corporatist at its root. What that is proven to you is that these people are known as anti-corporatist as they make out to be. You know, all these contradictions, all these, you know, hypocritical fools who were saying to you how, you know, capitalism would drive the prices up and they would shaft the consumer. Do you not remember that when they were saying that about the likes of Rockefeller, etc.? There's the Agricultural Adjustment Act that did exactly that, and there they are in support of it. These people are so inconsistent. They're all order shop. They're no consistent in any position that they take. And one hand they're telling you that, of course, these evil monopolists would drive the prices up and shaft the consumer during that of the so-called myth of the robber barons, and now here they are going on about, oh well, you know, we'll just you know, drive the price up by restricting productive output, essentially doing exactly what's replicated of a monopoly, and somehow they're saying, oh well, this is what, you know, fixes a Great Depression. You understand where I'm coming from? It's the inconsistency and that of the, you know, intellectual dishonesty.
FDR based his New Deal policy largely on what happened during World War I. which had ended only 15 years earlier in 1918. During that war, the government established planning boards to set wages and prices, and economic activity increased.
And that was a smart strategy that worked, because if you didn't do stuff like that, you would have major economic problems and, of course, a labor shortage. When you know a lot of our men are over in Europe fighting World War I, you fucking dumbass.
You know, this is exactly why these people are so economically illiterate. Not just for the perspective of when you start setting prices, you end up causing, you know, price shortages and stuff like that, or of course you end up causing the opposite, which is surplus waste problems. It happens all the time. You even saw this, and I mentioned this about that of the housing shortage crisis. Prior to the World War II, there was no housing shortage, and it wasn't until, of course, the rent controls were imposed. And as soon as the rent controls were imposed, that's when it exacerbated the housing shortage crisis. And as if by magic, they removed the price control after the Second World War, and you know, it magically just disappeared. And they think that it's because of the Second World War that caused that problem. This is what you're dealing with. These folk don't even understand, and they've never studied anything at all today with prices. They don't even bother to look. You know, any normal person that takes the interest and wants to learn economics, they would sit and think to themselves, well, why does price ceilings result in price shortage problems? That's what a normal person does, instead of a cultist. Well, a cultist doesn't do that. A cultist just sits and takes the position, you know, it's somehow fixing wages and prices, it's somehow improved the economy and it's somehow made everybody better off. We'll just ignore the very fact that when you artificially raise the prices and wages, that of course, when the inflation drives up and keep wiping them out, and of course we'll completely ignore the fact that there's a demand from the employer, and of course we'll also ignore the very fact that when they raise the prices is harming the consumer, and of course we'll completely ignore the very fact that they're cutting back work week hours to compensate paying for it.
If it worked during wartime, FDR reasoned, it should work during peacetime.
And it fucking did.
But Roosevelt confused the increase in economic activity that was actually the result of inflated war demands as being due to government planning.
And without those plans, during World War I, we would have been in a much worse position than when we were. So, factually incorrect.
These people honestly believe that deflation is somehow a bad thing for the economy, and they believe in all these myths like the myth of the robber barons. They honestly think that they can just make up things as they go along, kind of like the definition of a monopoly. They think they can just pull it out of thin air. We'll just pull it out of thin air and somehow that'll constitute as an argument. We'll just claim that a monopoly means owning 90%. We'll just make it up as we go along, because you know what does an actual definition mean? We'll just create our own definition as we go along.
The government, Roosevelt concluded, could much better manage the economy in a time of crisis than private enterprise.
And that is an undeniable, undebatable historical fact that you fucking right-wing retards refuse to accept, because you know you've been proven wrong.
Well, folk, just like I've touched upon in terms of the statistics of the unemployment and stuff like that, it was anything but. You even seen for the other tables, the GNP statistics, it was anything but of a recovery. So how does he constitute that as an argument? If he's honestly trying to tell you that after looking at that statistics, that is what you call a recovery, then I'll be damned.
And that's why you gotta do revisionist history crap like this video.
Which in his worldview only considered its own selfish interests. Therefore, government guidance, not free enterprise, was the citizen's steadfast ally.
And that's true, especially as long as the government is not bought off. The corporations and Wall Street and military-industrial complex and all that stuff, which, by the way, you and PragerU admit that you don't even think that's even a reality.
In one hand, they're basically telling you how government intervention is all this utopian nonsense, and somehow it's basically about saving you from such a depression and everything. It's basically about saving the economy. You know, all this usual piffle. They could even tell you the damage caused by artificially fixing the interest rates low, caused by central banks and what have you, and everything else to do with their, you know, central planning to such an extent. But he tells you that somehow this is a great benefit to the economy, but then he starts talking about corporatism, the merger between state and corporate power, where he says, oh, you know, the government's just, you know, somehow bought off. That how the government got to that position was because special interest groups lobbied government for special interest favours, and through the government's intervention setting down barriers to entry into the market, that's what led to the corporatist system. And one hand, he's basically claiming that how great the government's intervention is, but in the economic reality, it's precisely that that gave rise to this corporatist system.
Contrary to what you might think, big business, including autos and steel, were happy to go along with FDR's plan, at least at first.
We're with it all the way because it fucking helped them, you moron.
If the government was going to ensure their profits, who were they to complain? So instead of prohibiting monopolies, something the government is actually supposed to do, the NIRA created monopolies on the condition that these favored industries immediately raised wages significantly and bargained collectively with labor. Not surprisingly, the Supreme Court declared the NIRA unconstitutional in May 1935, stating that FDR violated constitutional separation of powers. He had meddled in an area, private business, where he had no constitutional right.
Wow, what a bunch of debunked regressive crap that was. First off, it isn't unconstitutional for the government to regulate the economy. It always has and always will. And it's not just in the US, other countries do it too. So that was the wrong ruling. Also, as you said, it helped collective bargaining and increased unionization, which helped workers.
You notice how this boy is just completely body swerved the part about that today with the monopolisation, how the government gave special interest favours to these, you know, specific groups, these specific industries, and drove the price up and shafted the consumer. He thinks it's as simple as, oh well, you just, you know, raise the minimum wage and somehow that just fixes everything, and with the higher minimum wage, you know, people have more money in their pockets to spend, but at the same time, everybody, I'll completely ignore inflation because, you know, inflation just has nothing to do with it. We'll just ignore the consequences of running the printing press. These were the same people, as I touch upon again, who says to you that these evil monopolists, evil robber barons, the evil likes of John Davis and Rockefeller. Oh, how evil he was. Oh, it's so fucking evil. A giant trust. How dare they drive the price up? Forget the point, the very fact that he never drove the price up. John Davis and Rockefeller was in a period of deflation, so the consumer price index was driving down. In their argument, they were saying, oh, it's, you know, evil Rockefeller, you know, he drove the price up and shafted everybody. He used predatory pricing and he shafted everybody and he held a monopoly. But then, here we are, an example during the 1930s when the government does something that they wrongly accused the likes of Rockefeller of. In other words, what the government did was it basically restricted the productive output and basically increased the prices of everything. They're basically supporting exactly what they accused the trusts of doing, and now he's basically body swerving it and, you know, try to make it sound as if it's something good. It was all for the benefit of the consumer.
And the program also created the PWA, the Public Works Administration, which helped employed people to help work on infrastructure projects across the country, just like the WPA later on, a couple years later, would also do as well.
So it's like I says, Tom Woods has an excellent video that addresses much to do with the Great Depression, that, shall I say, more to do with the New Deal. He mentions about that today with the helping of the workers, as he mentions, the legislation. Let's have a listen to what, you know, Tom Woods has to say on that issue.
The Great Depression?
Yes, the Great Depression. Yes, it's the worst economic disaster in American history. But we had FDR. We had the New Deal. That ship was righted. And America ends up becoming the economic superpower we all know and love today.
No, that's not true at all. The Great Depression persisted all throughout the 1930s. On the eve of World War II, unemployment was nearly 20%, even after all the New Deal programs. And it wound up being the longest downturn in American history, not in spite of the government's involvement, but because of it.
I still think that under extreme situations, maybe you have to rely on big companies and rely on stable prices in order to make sure to cut down on that sky-high unemployment and make sure everyone has a job. That's the problem that needs to be solved.
A lot of people think of things like the Works Progress Administration when they think about the New Deal, that gave people jobs. If we look at the work of economists John Joseph Wallace and Daniel Benjamin, they found that the jobs created by the WPA and the other New Deal spending programs either just displaced private sector jobs that existed already, or actually destroyed those jobs because these programs just dried up capital that could have been used for private sector investment. And we now know, because of historian Bob Higgs, that business at the time really held off from investing because they didn't know what the federal government was going to do next, and nobody wanted to expose himself to an unpredictable federal government, so they just bided their time, and meanwhile the economy continued to suffer. What it boils down to is there were a lot of programs, but they all shared the same basic flaw, that a group of experts are going to direct resources better than you and I can.
So it's basically like I explained earlier about the malinvestment, and that's essentially what Tom Woods is explaining there. Tom Woods is basically saying that the market knows best because, of course, through consumers' demand, consumer and their time preference, you see prices drive up, and it's because there's price fluctuation and the market knows where resources are to go. When you remove price fluctuation and you end up fixing prices like FDR did, and you've no longer got the information of profits and losses, and you've destroyed that information with malinvestment, that is to say, you end up with the resource misallocation into the wrong parts of the market. So you end up wasting valuable scarce resources. Now these are people folk. These are the same flaming hypocrites, are the ones who claim to be environmentalists, and they always say to you, and I just heard it more recently, and it was one of them that says to us, oh, you know, capitalism, you know, we shouldn't go with a free market because there's finite resources on the planet Earth and there's not infinite growth. Any socialist that comes out and says that to you, pull them up on that fact. And how can they justify the economic calculation problem that essentially ends up taking resources and misallocating it into the wrong parts of the market, which is basically the loss-making areas of the market? I hope that is basically covered what you wanted to see, or, you know, if you've learned anything from it, then great. Of course, like I mentioned, you know, what caused the Great Depression was the Fed's intervention through the open market operations, manipulation of the interest rates, changing of the reserve ratios, running the printing press, all the interventionist policies. That's what they call a saviour. Anyway, folk, thank you for watching my video. Be sure to comment, like, and of course share the video on that. And thank you for watching. Cheers.